She was 56 years old. She had nothing, and a room full of men were laughing. In the dusty saloon of Blackthorn Ridge, a man stood on a chair and offered $50 to anyone willing to take his sister off his hands, like she was a broken mule he was desperate to sell before sundown. The crowd roared. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody even looked at her with pity. They looked at her the way people look at something already dead. But one man in the back of the room wasn't laughing, and that changed everything. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now sit back, because this one will stay with you. Blackthorn Ridge, Wyoming Territory, October 1883. The cold came early that year. It rolled down from the northern ranges like something alive and angry, stripping the last brittle leaves off the cottonwood trees along Main Street and driving most of Blackthorn Ridge's decent folk indoors before the sun had even finished setting. By the time the lanterns flickered on inside the Silver Spur Saloon, the temperature had dropped low enough to crack the mud in the street into hard, jagged plates, and the wind cut through every gap and every wall like it had a personal grievance with warmth itself. Rowan Creed sat alone at a corner table, the way he always did. He was not a man who invited conversation. 43 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw like quarried stone and eyes the color of a winter sky 2 hours before a storm, pale gray, watchful, and utterly empty of whatever brightness they might once have held. He wore a single-breasted cavalry coat that had survived 4 years of war and another 15 of hard mountain living, and he nursed a glass of whiskey that he had no real intention of finishing. He came to the Silver Spur 3 or 4 times a month for the same reason a man stands on a porch and watches traffic pass. Not because he wants company, but because complete silence can eventually start to feel like a fist pressing against the inside of your skull. He wasn't watching anyone in particular when it started. He was watching the fire. Then the doors swung open and Frank Hale walked in, and the whole energy of the room shifted the way it always shifted when Frank Hale walked anywhere. A ripple of amusement and contempt that followed the man like a smell he'd long since stopped noticing himself. Frank Hale was 40 years old, red-faced, soft in the middle, and possessed of a gambler's optimism that had never once been justified by results. He owed money to at least 6 men in that saloon alone. He smiled at all of them anyway, broad and unashamed, the smile of a man who had made peace with his own worthlessness and decided to find it charming. Behind him, barely through the door, stood a woman. Rowan noticed her this way you notice something that doesn't belong. A wrong note in a familiar song. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. She was tall for a woman, angular in the way that hard decades make a person angular, with gray-streaked hair pinned back under a faded brown bonnet that had lost its shape seasons ago. She wore a wool coat that might have been respectable once, back when it was someone else's, and she carried a single canvas bag against her chest with both hands, the way a person carries something they are afraid will be taken. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at the floor. Not at her feet, at the floor. There is a difference. Looking at your feet is embarrassment. Looking at the floor is something that's gone past embarrassment entirely, something that has come out the other side into a different country where a person has simply learned to take up as little space as possible. Rowan looked at her for exactly 3 seconds before Frank Hale climbed up onto a vacant chair and cleared his throat with theatrical importance. The saloon quieted. Men turned. Card games paused. "Gentlemen," Frank announced, his voice carrying the practiced ring of a man who'd spent years talking people into bad decisions. And I use that term generously. He waited for the laughter. It came. He grinned. "I have before you tonight a business proposition of rare and unusual nature." "Sit down, Frank," someone called from the bar. Hear me out, hear me out." He swept his arm toward the woman at the door with the showmanship of a carnival barker presenting a dubious attraction. "Most of you know my sister, Margaret, widow, 56 years of age, good Christian woman, hardworking." He paused, timing it perfectly. "And absolutely, completely, 100%, nobody's problem but mine." The laughter was louder this time. Margaret did not look up. "Now I am a generous man." "You're a broke man," someone corrected, and the laughter doubled again. Frank pressed on, undeterred. "I am prepared to offer $50, American, to any man willing to take responsibility for my sister's welfare, lodging, employment, Whatever arrangement suits. He looked around the room with bright, expectant eyes. Any takers? Good woman. Quiet. Won't cause trouble. Silence. Not the polite silence of consideration. The loud, decisive silence of a room full of men who have already made up their minds and are merely waiting for someone else to say it first. She cook? Someone asked. Tolerably, Frank said. She's old, Frank. She's experienced, Frank corrected. Same thing, and neither one's worth $50. The speaker was a heavy-set man near the bar named Cliff Dalton, who owned the largest cattle operation within 40 miles and liked to make sure every room he entered knew it. He looked at Margaret with the assessing squint of a man evaluating livestock. What's she good for exactly? Woman that age? Takes more feeding than she's worth. That's not a charitable thing to say, Frank said, though without real conviction. It's an honest thing, Dalton replied, and several men nodded along, the way men nod when someone has put cruelty in the language of practicality. I'll tell you what, Frank, you can't find anyone willing to take her on. You send her out to my ranch. I'll put her to work in the laundry, room and board, no wages. He smiled at his own generosity. That's the best offer a woman like that is going to get in this territory. Rowan set down his whiskey glass. Very quietly, very carefully. He had not moved in several minutes. Now something shifted behind those winter-gray eyes. Not dramatic, not obvious, but present. The way a change in wind direction is present before the weather actually turns. He looked at Margaret Hale. She was still looking at the floor, but her hands had tightened on that canvas bag until her knuckles had gone white. And Rowan, who had spent 4 years of war learning to read what people's bodies said when their faces said nothing, understood exactly what those white knuckles meant. She had heard what Dalton said. She had heard all of it, and she had heard it before. Not just tonight, but woven through her entire life. A chorus she had stopped flinching at because flinching requires the belief that it might stop. The bidding, if it could be called that, went nowhere. Men made jokes. Frank tried several more times to sweeten the offer, adding increasingly desperate descriptions of Margaret's various competencies. Nobody raised a hand. The conversation drifted back toward card games and whiskey and the natural concerns of men who had decided, without particular malice, that a 56-year-old widow was simply not their concern. Rowan pushed his chair back and stood up. He was not a tall man, maybe 6 feet even, but he had the particular stillness of someone who has been in enough genuinely dangerous situations that he no longer needed to perform danger. Men felt it without knowing what they were feeling. Conversations near him quieted. Space opened. He walked to the bar, reached into his coat pocket, and set down $50 in paper money. Then he turned and looked at Frank Hale, still perched on his chair, whose expression had cycled rapidly through surprise, calculation, and cautious hope in the span of about 2 seconds. I'll take the deal, Rowan said. The saloon went quiet again, different this time. Frank stared. You serious? I don't make offers I'm not serious about. Rowan Creed, someone said carefully, from somewhere to his left. You got a woman up at that mountain cabin of yours? I have a cabin, Rowan said. It's large enough. She's 56 years old, Dalton said from the bar, as if Rowan might have missed this crucial detail. Rowan looked at him, just looked, the way a man looks at something beneath consideration. So am I. Nearly, he said. Hadn't noticed it made me worthless. He picked up the money and walked across the saloon floor toward the door. He stopped in front of Margaret Hale. She looked up. For the first time all evening, she looked up. And Rowan saw eyes that were dark brown and sharp with intelligence, set in a face that life had carved rather than simply aged. There was wariness in those eyes, and something more carefully guarded underneath it, a grief so old it had calcified into something structural, like a bone that had broken and healed crooked and was now simply part of the architecture of her. Mrs. Hale, he said. He did not extend his hand or touch his hat or do anything performative. He simply said her name like it was a complete sentence. My name is Rowan Creed. I have a cabin in the mountains about 8 miles north of here. You're welcome to come if you want a place to stay through winter. Nobody will bother you there. He paused. I'm not buying anything. I'm just offering a place to be. What you do with it is your own concern. She studied him for a long moment. Why? She said. Her voice was low and careful, worn down to its essential parts. the voice of a woman who had learned not to spend words unnecessarily. Rowan considered the question honestly. "Because Dalton's going to approach your brother about that laundry arrangement as soon as I walk out that door," he said. "And I have seen that ranch. I have seen the women he puts in his laundry, and I would not put a stray dog in that situation." He met her eyes directly. "That's the whole of it. No other reason." Margaret Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her brother, still up on his chair, already calculating what he'd do with $50. Then she looked at Cliff Dalton, who was watching the whole exchange with narrow, proprietary eyes. She picked up her canvas bag. "All right," she said. "I'll come." They rode out of Blackthorn Ridge in silence, the horses picking their way carefully along the mountain trail in the dark. Rowan carried a lantern on the saddle horn and kept a steady pace, not so fast that Margaret's older mare struggled, not so slow that the cold became unbearable. He offered her an extra blanket from his saddlebag without comment, and she took it without comment, and they made their way through the dark pines with the wind moving through the canopy above them, and the stars appearing and disappearing behind ragged clouds. Margaret had said almost nothing since they left the saloon. Rowan hadn't pressed her. He had spent enough years in the mountains alone to understand that silence between people could be either a wall or a bridge, and it was rarely useful to force it into either shape prematurely. After about 2 miles, she spoke. "You paid $50, she said. "I did. That's a considerable sum." "It is." Another silence. An owl called from somewhere in the dark pines to the left, and one of the horses, Margaret's mare, flicked her ears and shifted sideways before settling. "I want you to know," Margaret said carefully, like she was placing each word down on unstable ground and testing it before putting weight on it, "that I intend to earn it. I can cook, I can clean, I can do laundry, mending, preserve food. I'm capable of—" "Mrs. Hale." Rowan didn't raise his voice or sharpen it. He just stopped the flow of words. "You don't need to inventory yourself." She fell quiet. "You're not an employee," he said. "You're a guest. There's a room that sits empty. You're welcome to it. In the spring, if you want to move on, you move on. If you want to stay, we'll figure out what that looks like." He glanced sideways at her in the dark, and she was sitting straight in the saddle despite everything. Spine erect, chin level, and he noticed that too, filed it away. "But I'm not keeping a ledger on you. You don't owe me anything." He felt rather than saw her reaction, a kind of stillness, like a body that has been bracing for an impact and slowly, tentatively, begins to realize the impact may not be coming. "That is a very unusual offer," she said at last. "I'm a fairly unusual person," he replied. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. The memory of a smile, perhaps, or the very early architecture of one. "Yes," she said quietly, "I expect you are." The cabin came into view around a bend in the trail, a solid structure of chinked pine logs, low and square, with smoke already rising from the chimney because Rowan had stoked the fire before riding into town that evening. Lantern light glowed warm gold through 2 windows. There was a small barn behind it, and a vegetable garden laid over for winter, and a water wheel over a narrow stream that ran down from the ridge. And all of it sat in a small clearing in the mountain forest, as if the trees had stepped back to make space for something that deserved to exist. Margaret looked at it for a long moment from horseback. "It's solid," she said. "Built it myself," Rowan replied. "Took 3 summers. You're good with your hands." "I had motivation. I needed somewhere the world couldn't easily get to." He dismounted and took both horses to the barn, and by the time he came back to the cabin, Margaret was already inside, standing near the fire with her canvas bag still in her hands and her bonnet still on her head, looking around at the interior of the cabin with an expression that was trying very hard to stay neutral and not entirely succeeding. It was not grand, it was not pretty in any deliberate way, but it was clean, genuinely clean, not surface clean, and warm, and the shelves along the walls held an orderly collection of preserved food and tools and books that told you something real about the man who had arranged them. There was a rocking chair near the fire with a worn wool blanket folded over its arm. There were 2 mugs on the table, which was set near the window, and a cast iron pot hanging over the fire that smelled of venison and rosemary. "The back room is yours," Rowan said, gesturing toward a door on the far wall. "It's small. There's a bed and a washstand. You can rearrange it however you want." Margaret looked at the door to the back room, then she looked at Rowan. "Why did you really do it?" she said. "The truth, not the Dalton explanation. I believed that. That was true. But that's not all of it. A man doesn't spend $50 on a stranger over principle alone. Not a man like you." Rowan considered that for a moment, then sat down in the chair across from the fire and laced his fingers together and looked at the flames. "I came back from the war and I didn't know what to do with myself," he said. "So I came up here, figured I'd disappear. I was good at it. I'd spent years learning how." He was quiet for a moment. "But you reach a point where you realize that disappearing and dying are not entirely different things, and maybe you're not actually ready for either one." He looked up at her. "I saw a woman tonight being treated like a problem to be disposed of. I've been treated like that too. Not in the same way, I won't claim that, but I know the feeling of being something other people want to make invisible." He shrugged, one small movement of one shoulder. "I didn't want to watch it happen." Margaret set her canvas bag down on the table. For the first time since he'd met her, she let go of it. "I have not been treated with consideration in a very long time," she said. Her voice was level. She was not asking for sympathy. She was simply stating a fact, the way you state a geographical feature. Here is the mountain, here's the river, here is the condition of my life. "I know," Rowan said. "I am not accustomed to it." "I imagine not." She stood there in the firelight, tall and angular and worn down to her essential self, and she looked like a woman who had survived so many things that survival had become indistinguishable from just being alive, and who had somewhere in the process forgotten that they were supposed to be different. "Thank you," she said finally, very quietly. "For the room." "Eat something first," Rowan said, reaching for the ladle by the fire. "It's been a long day." She sat down across from him at the table, and he served her a bowl of venison stew, and outside the mountain wind moved through the dark pines and the fire crackled and settled, and the two of them ate in a silence that was, for the first time in a very long time for both of them, something closer to peaceful than painful. Winter came fast and fierce to the mountains, the way it always did above 4,000 feet. Not gradually, not apologetically, but with sudden authority, dropping a foot of snow on the clearing in a single night and sealing the world in white silence by the end of October. The trail down to Blackthorn Ridge became impassable for stretches at a time, and the world shrank to the circumference of two people, one cabin, one barn, and the narrow band of tree line along the ridge. Margaret threw herself into work. Not because Rowan demanded it, he had been entirely sincere about the ledger, but because work was the only architecture she had for a day. Without it, she didn't know how to occupy the hours. She was up before him every morning, the fire already stoked and coffee already on by the time he came out of his room, and she attacked every domestic task with the focused intensity of someone trying to prove something, though she could not have said to whom. Rowan watched this for exactly 1 week without comment. Then on the 8th morning, when she had cleaned the same shelf twice, he put down his coffee and said, "Come outside." She looked up. "I have the shelf is clean, Mrs. Hale. Come outside." She came outside. He handed her a rifle. She looked at it as if he had handed her a live snake. It's not loaded yet," he said. "Just hold it, get the weight of it." She held it with rigid, unfamiliar hands, arms slightly extended, like something she was prepared to drop. "It's heavier than I expected," she said. "Everything is, until you're used to it. Hold it properly." He adjusted her grip, moving her hands with the impersonal efficiency of a teacher, not touching her any more than was necessary. "Stock against your shoulder, look down the barrel, find the sight at the end. That little piece of raised metal. You see it?" "I see it." "That's your reference point. Everything you want to hit, you line up with that." She stood in the snow outside the cabin door with the rifle against her shoulder, and the cold air came off the ridgeline, and her breath made small clouds, and she squinted down the barrel at a knot in a pine tree 20 yards away. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked. "Because you should know how," he said. "I am 56 years old. I am aware of that. Most people would say I am too old to learn." Rowan looked at her. "Most people," he said, "are saying a lot of things tonight in a saloon that I don't intend to help them be right about." She was quiet for a moment. Then she fired. The shot went wide and the recoil knocked her back a step and she nearly lost her footing in the snow, and she recovered her balance and looked at the tree, which was entirely unharmed. And then she looked at Rowan with an expression that had surprise and embarrassment in it, and something else underneath both of those things. Something that was almost the beginning of wanting to try again. Again, she said. Rowan almost smiled. Again, he agreed. They developed, without discussing it, a rhythm to their days. Mornings were domestic, Margaret's domain, though Rowan always helped with the heavier tasks without being asked, which she found disconcerting and then gradually stopped finding disconcerting. Afternoons they worked outside together, splitting wood, maintaining the barn, checking the traps Rowan kept along the ridge. Evenings they sat near the fire, and Rowan read and Margaret mended or wrote letters she had no way to send, and occasionally one of them said something and the other responded, and slowly, carefully, the way two animals from different territories learn to share a water source, they began to know each other. She learned that he had nightmares. She didn't mention it. He learned that she cried sometimes in the back room, very quietly, when she thought he was asleep. He didn't mention that either. What they did mention, slowly over weeks of evenings by the fire, was everything else. His years in the cavalry. Her marriage to a man who had been decent but sick for the last decade of his life, and the slow erasure of her own existence as she poured herself into his care. The children she had never had. The brother who had loved her once, she thought, before money had gotten between them. The way a town that knew you could still look through you as if you weren't there. When did you become invisible to them? Rowan asked one evening. The fire was low, and the snow was ticking against the window, and they were both tired in the comfortable way of people who have worked hard and earned their rest. Margaret thought about it for a longer moment than he expected. The week after James died, she said, his people came and took the furniture and said I was welcome to stay with any of them who had room, which none of them did, as it turned out. And I went to apply for work at the Calloway household. They needed a housekeeper. And Mrs. Calloway looked at me and said, she paused, composed herself. Not with distress, she was past distress about this, but with the care of someone handling something sharp. She said, I need someone capable, Margaret, not someone who looks like they need looking after themselves. A beat. I was 49. I had managed a household for 22 years. Rowan said nothing. He understood that some things were not said in order to receive a response. I tried 11 more positions over the next 7 years, Margaret said. I was told I was too old for each of them, too slow, too set in my ways. She looked at her hands in her lap. You hear it enough times. You begin to wonder if they're right. They weren't, Rowan said. Rowan's house. No, she agreed quietly. They weren't. But wondering and knowing are very different things when you're hungry and cold and your own brother is trying to sell you in a saloon. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. You're not any of those things, Rowan said. Not slow, not incapable, not past usefulness. He looked at her directly. You hit that mark at 40 yards yesterday. You preserved 16 jars of venison last week that will last us till March. You rechinked the north wall of the barn without being asked, and did it better than I would have. He paused. You are one of the most capable people I have met in a very long time, and I spent 20 years in the military around capable people. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. You say things like they're just facts, she said. They are facts. Most people don't bother. I'm aware of that, Rowan said. Most people are idiots. And for the first time, the first genuine, unguarded time, Margaret Hale laughed. It was a short laugh, startled out of her. Not the polished social laugh of a woman performing amusement, but the real thing, sharp and bright, surprised at itself. And it changed her face entirely for the 2 seconds it lasted, and Rowan felt something in his chest move that he had believed for a very long time was no longer capable of moving. He looked back at his book. Outside, the mountain held them in its cold, indifferent arms, and the fire burned down, and the night deepened, and in the small, warm circle of the cabin, two people who had each believed themselves at the end of something began, without acknowledging it, to suspect they might be at the beginning instead. November settled over the mountain like a judgment, heavy and absolute, burying the clearing under 3 feet of packed snow and reducing the visible world to a narrow theater bounded by dark pines and gray sky. The trail to Blackthorn Ridge had been impassable for 2 weeks when Margaret Hale discovered she was no longer afraid of the rifle. It happened on a Tuesday morning, though the days had begun to blur at the edges the way they do when routine replaces calendar. She had risen before dawn, stoked the fire, put the coffee on, and then, instead of beginning the breakfast she always began, she had taken the rifle down from its hooks on the wall, checked the chamber the way Rowan had shown her, loaded it with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made peace with a new skill, and walked outside into the blue-gray pre-dawn cold. She stood at the edge of the clearing, breath visible, feet planted in the snow, and she shot the same knot in the same pine tree she had been shooting at for 6 weeks. She hit it on the first try. She stood there for a moment afterward, the sound of the shot still ringing off the ridgeline, and she felt something she did not immediately have words for. Not pride exactly. Pride implied an audience. This was something more private than pride. It was the sensation of a door inside herself opening onto a room she had not known was there, and finding it warm. She was reloading when Rowan appeared in the cabin doorway, coffee in hand, taking in the scene with the quiet alertness that was simply his natural state. "First try," she said, without turning around. "I heard," he said. "Don't make it into something large." "I wasn't going to," but there was something in his voice, not quite a smile, but the acoustic equivalent of one, and she heard it, and she didn't mind it the way she thought she would. She came back inside and made breakfast, and they ate, and neither of them mentioned the rifle again that day. But something had shifted, fine as a hair's difference in compass bearing, insignificant over short distances, revelatory over long ones. The weeks that followed had a quality Margaret would struggle to describe later. When she tried to account for them in the cramped handwriting of the letters she still composed and still could not send. She wrote once that it was like thawing. Then she crossed that out, because thawing implied she had been frozen, and frozen implied helpless, and she was finding, to her own sustained amazement, that she had never been helpless at all. She had been prevented. There is a critical difference between those two things, and she was in the slow, occasionally dizzying process of learning it. Rowan taught her everything without making it feel like instruction. He showed her how to read the trap lines along the North Ridge, which animals had been through, when, how hungry, how healthy, by reading the tracks and the disturbances in the snow with a patience and fluency that made the wilderness feel less like a foreign country and more like a language she had simply never been given the opportunity to learn. He showed her how to field dress a deer without apology for the reality of it, because reality does not require apology, only competence. He showed her how to read the sky for weather with the specific mountain literacy of a man who had been caught unprepared once and decided once was sufficient. She showed him things too, though she was slower to recognize that what she was doing counted as showing. She reorganized his preservation stores with a systematic logic that tripled their accessibility, and he stood in the middle of the storage room one afternoon, looking at it, and said simply, "I've been doing that wrong for 15 years. She repaired the hinges on the barn door with materials he hadn't thought to use for the purpose, and the door, which had been dragging since September, swung smooth and easy for the first time in years. When he came down with 3 days of fever in mid-November, the kind that comes suddenly in cold weather and burns hot before breaking, she managed the cabin and the animals and the trap lines alone and had broth on the fire when he woke up on the third morning, pale and depleted and apparently startled to find everything functional. "You ran the traps," he said, pushing himself upright against the headboard, with the effortful dignity of a man who doesn't like being seen reduced. "Someone had to. That's 4 miles in the cold." "I'm aware of how far 4 miles is, Rowan." She set the broth on the crate beside his bed. "Drink that, all of it. The rabbit traps on the east line need resetting. I'll do it after you're on your feet again, but not before, because someone needs to be present and functional in case you take a turn." He looked at her for a moment. "You're bossy," he said, with something that was definitely amusement. "I'm efficient," she corrected. "There is a difference. Drink the broth." He drank the broth. It was during those 3 days of his illness, days she would never have chosen but which shaped something between them nonetheless, that the particular quality of their companionship began to clarify. She was not nursing a patient, though she cared for him with the practiced competence of a woman who had nursed her husband through a decade of decline. She was not serving an employer, though she managed the homestead with focused capability. She realized on the second evening when she sat in the chair beside his door, listening to his breathing, even out into sleep, simply caring about whether he was all right. That distinction, which might have seemed minor, arrived to Margaret Hale with the force of something seismic. She had not let herself care about whether anyone was all right in a very long time. The arithmetic of it was brutally simple. Every person she had cared for had either died or discarded her, and at some point, she could not have named the precise moment, only that it had happened. She had learned to keep herself at a careful remove from the possibility of caring. It was not coldness, it was survival arithmetic. You do not keep investing in a mine that has collapsed, but the mountain did something to that arithmetic. Or perhaps Rowan did. Or perhaps it was simply that for the first time in longer than she could calculate, she was being treated as though her continued well-being was a matter of natural concern rather than conditional utility, and something in her that had been held rigid against the cold of other people's indifference had begun, incrementally, to release. When his fever broke on the third morning and he came out of his room looking wrung out but upright and poured his own coffee and said, "Thank you, Margaret." He had begun using her first name somewhere in the second week, casually, without announcement, and she had let it happen. She said, "You're welcome," and meant it in a way that encompassed more than broth and trap lines. December arrived and the snow deepened further, and the world continued to contract, and the cabin continued to expand. Rowan had books, more than she would have expected, stacked in 2 careful rows along the shelf beside the window, and on evenings when the wind was bad enough to make even the barn an unappealing prospect, they read by firelight, sometimes aloud. He had a copy of David Copperfield that was missing its first 40 pages, and she had read the novel before, and she told him what he was missing, and he listened with the attentive seriousness he brought to everything, and then said that it sounded like a novel about what happens when the people responsible for a child decide their own comfort matters more than his future. And she said yes, she supposed that was one way to read it. "Is that how you read it?" he asked. "I read it when I was 22, she said. "I thought it was a love story." "What do you think it is now?" She considered. "A survival story," she said, "dressed as a love story, which is possibly the most honest thing a novel can be." Rowan looked at her over the book. "That's a good reading. I've had more time to think about survival than most people." He was quiet for a moment, firelight moving across the planes of his face. "Do you think those things are mutually exclusive?" he said. "Survival and love." She did not answer immediately. Outside, the wind moved through the upper branches of the pines in a sound like distant water. "I used to think love was a luxury," she said finally. "Something you earned the right to once the necessary things were handled. And the necessary things were never quite handled." She paused. "So I suppose I decided, without ever quite deciding it, that it was simply not for me." "That's a decision you made for yourself based on information other people gave you," Rowan said. "Other people who were wrong." She looked at him sharply. Not defensively, but with the sharpness of someone who has received an unexpected truth and is assessing its dimensions. "You have a way," she said slowly, "of saying things that sound simple and turn out to be very large." "I spent 20 years not talking to anyone worth talking to," he said. "I got a backlog." She smiled. A real one this time. Not the startled laugh of that first night, but something slower and more deliberate, arrived at by choice. It changed her face, and Rowan saw it and looked back at his book. The snow kept falling. The days kept shortening and then, by December's end, imperceptibly lengthening again. January brought a cold snap that kept them inside for 11 days straight, burning through wood at a rate that required daily trips to the stack behind the barn. They played cards in the evenings. Margaret was unexpectedly ruthless at poker, which Rowan found genuinely funny. And they argued, once, with real heat, about whether the north fence line needed replacing before spring or could hold another season. And Margaret turned out to be right, which she did not make into a moment of victory, which Rowan respected more than he would have respected the victory. He was teaching her to track one morning in late January, a skill that requires a particular combination of patience and imagination, the ability to read an event backward through its physical evidence. When she stopped at a set of marks in the snow that she had not seen before and crouched down to examine them. "Mountain lion," she said. Rowan, standing behind her, said nothing for a moment. Then, "How do you know?" "The retracted claws. You told me about that. And the gate. And it's going toward the barn." She straightened and looked at him. "How long ago?" "This morning, before dawn." He was watching her with an expression she was still learning to read, somewhere between satisfaction and something quieter than satisfaction, something that had more weight to it. "You're learning fast. I have a good teacher." She said it simply, without self-consciousness, and then started walking toward the barn to check on the animals. "And I'm motivated. I find I prefer not being helpless." "You were never helpless," Rowan said, following her. "You were just in situations that were designed to make you feel that way." She stopped walking. She stood there in the snow, back to him, for 3 full seconds. Then she turned around, and her face had something in it that was difficult to look at directly. Not grief exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but something in the geography between those two territories. "Why do you say things like that to me?" she said. Not with accusation, with genuine puzzlement, the kind that comes from encountering something you don't have a category for. Rowan met her eyes. "Because they're true," he said, "and because someone should have been saying them to you for the last 20 years. And since they weren't, and I'm here, I see no reason not to." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the barn, and her spine was straight and her chin was level, and she moved through the snow like a woman who had remembered something important about herself. Rowan followed her, and neither of them said anything more about it, and they spent the next 2 hours checking on the livestock and resetting the fence line near the rear gate. And when they came back inside at noon, Margaret made coffee, and Rowan split the last of the morning's wood and brought it in. And they sat at the table across from each other with the winter light coming flat and gray through the window. And it was ordinary in every external detail, and something else entirely underneath. February was when the other thing happened, the thing that neither of them had been naming, but that had been building all winter with the patient inevitability of snowpack before a melt. It happened on an ordinary evening. They had eaten. The fire was good. Rowan was reading, and Margaret was working on a piece of mending. His cavalry coat had torn at the left sleeve, and she was repairing it with the concentrated attention she brought to everything. And she glanced up to ask him something about a passage she'd read earlier, and she found him already watching her, not with anything she could object to, not with anything performative. He was simply watching her work, the way you watch a fire, with a kind of undemanding attention that requires nothing back. And when their eyes met, he did not look away with the guilt of someone caught doing something improper. He simply kept looking, and his expression was open in a way she had rarely seen it, and she understood in that moment, with a sudden and breathtaking clarity, that Rowan Creed was not a man who required anything from her. He was a man who simply wanted her to be there. The distinction was so foreign to her experience of how men regarded women that she sat with it for a moment, holding it carefully, afraid that examining it too directly would cause it to dissolve. Then she looked back at the mending in her hands, and her heart was doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest, and she said very quietly, "You're staring." "I know," he said, equally quiet. "It's rude." "Probably." She did not tell him to stop. He did not stop. And outside, the February wind moved through the mountain pines, and the fire crackled and settled, and two people who had arrived at each other's lives by the cruelest possible accident sat in the warmth of what they had built. And the silence between them was no longer a wall or even a bridge, but simply the shared air of two people who had, without planning it, begun to belong in the same room. Spring came the way it always does in the mountains, grudgingly, in increments, winter releasing its grip 1 degree at a time, and then sometimes snatching it back for a final frost that could kill the first green shoots if you weren't watching. They were watching. Margaret had planned the garden with a thoroughness that suggested she had been thinking about it all winter. A cold frame for the early starts, a planting schedule that staggered the crops by frost tolerance, an ambitious expansion of last year's growing area into the south-facing slope where the snow retreated first. Rowan looked at her plans. She had drawn them out on the back of an old letter, precise and detailed, and said, "This is twice what I grew last year." "We're feeding more people than you were last year," she said. "It's 2 people, Margaret." "It is currently 2 people," she agreed. "It may not remain 2 people." He looked at her. "I've been writing letters," she said, "to women I know. Women in situations similar to what mine was." She held his gaze steadily. "If you object, tell me now and I'll stop. This is your home and I won't act against your wishes. But I think there are women who need what this place is. And I think—" She paused, choosing the words with care. I think you built something worth sharing. Rowan looked at the garden plans for a long moment. How many letters did you write? He said. 7. How many do you think will come? I don't know. Maybe none. Maybe all of them. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the south-facing slope, calculating something she couldn't quite read. Then he looked back at her. We're going to need to expand the storage room, he said. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I already measured it, she said. This time, Rowan did smile. Fully, without reservation, a smile that rearranged his entire face and revealed in it something much younger than 43, something that war and isolation had buried but not, it turned out, destroyed. Of course you did, he said. She smiled back at him, and the mountain light was April thin and pale as new paper, and the snow was retreating from the clearing's edges like a tide going out. And in the dark soil of the expanded garden bed, below the frost line where the cold hadn't yet reached, something was already beginning to stir. Something that had been waiting a very long time for the ground to be ready. The first letter arrived back in May. It came with a supply rider named Gus Tillman, who made the mountain run twice monthly when the trail was passable, and who handed it to Margaret with the mildly curious expression of a man who had not previously delivered correspondence to this particular cabin. The handwriting on the outside was cramped and urgent, the kind of writing that happens when a person is trying to say too much in too small a space. And the return name was Clara Voss, a woman Margaret had known briefly in Blackthorn Ridge, a widow of 61 who had been doing peace laundry for the Dalton Ranch for 3 years in exchange for a cot in the wash house. Margaret read the letter at the kitchen table while Rowan was in the barn. She read it twice. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the middle distance. And by the time Rowan came in smelling of horse and sawdust, she had already begun calculating the storage room expansion. One's coming, she said. He didn't ask which one. He washed his hands at the basin and said, When? 2 weeks, if she can manage the trail. She says she has nothing to pack, so the journey should be simple. Margaret paused. She sounds frightened. She probably is. Rowan dried his hands and looked at her. Were you, when you came up the mountain? She thought about it honestly. I was past frightened, she said. I was in a place beyond it, where things stopped mattering the way they should. She folded Claire's letter carefully along its original creases. She's not past it yet. That's actually better. It means she still expects things to be different. Clara Voss arrived on a Thursday afternoon, riding a borrowed mule that looked nearly as exhausted as she did, with a canvas sack tied to the saddle horn and the eyes of a woman who has been tensed against impact for so long, she no longer knows how to hold her shoulders any other way. She was small and round where Margaret was tall and angular, with white hair and work-reddened hands and a quality of determined cheerfulness layered over something much darker, the way people paint over water damage without fixing the leak. Margaret met her at the edge of the clearing. She did not say anything elaborate. She simply took Claire's mule by the bridle and said, "Come inside, the coffee's on," in exactly the tone she would use with someone returning from a short errand rather than a long and frightening journey through the mountains, and something in Clara's shoulders came down a quarter inch. "It's real then," Claire said, looking at the cabin. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined." "It's real," Margaret said. "Come inside." Rowan made himself scarce for the rest of that afternoon, with the particular tact of a man who understands that certain conversations require the absence of men entirely. He found things to do in the barn and along the fence line and did not come in until supper, by which time Clara had been shown her room, the storage room, reconfigured, which turned out to be adequate for a person who had been sleeping in a wash house, and had cried once, quietly, and recovered herself, and was sitting at the kitchen table with Margaret helping to prepare the evening meal, with the tentative helpfulness of someone who is trying very carefully not to impose. 2 weeks after Clara came, a second letter arrived, then a third, from 2 different women, both of whom had apparently heard from Clara through the supply rider's informal communication network, which moved information through the mountains with surprising efficiency. One of them, a woman named Ruth Packard, was 58 and had walked 30 miles from a ranch near Settlers Crossing where she had been working without pay. The definition of working without pay being, as she wrote it, that she had been told her room and food were her pay, which was a mathematics that only benefited one party in the arrangement. By June, there were 4 women in the cabin and the storage extension, and the garden Margaret had planned was suddenly not ambitious enough, and the south slope was turned and planted in a cooperative effort that suggested these particular women, whatever else had been done to them, had not forgotten how to work. Rowan moved through all of it with the adaptable pragmatism of a former soldier. He assessed the situation, identified what was needed, and provided it without ceremony. He built a second sleeping room off the east side of the cabin in 3 weeks, working from first light to last, and accepted help from the women when they offered it without condescension and without the particular masculine awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to being assisted. Ruth Packard, who had built her own first home from raw timber at the age of 22, turned out to be a better hand with a broadaxe than he was, and he acknowledged this without apparent difficulty and asked her to handle the corner joinery. "You're not bothered by us being here," Clara said to him one evening, with the directness of someone who has decided that at 61 she has earned the right to ask what she actually wants to know. Most men would be. Their home filling up with women they don't know. "It's not only my home," Rowan said, without looking up from the hinge he was fitting. "It's Margaret's too. Has been since February." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Margaret, who was across the clearing and could not hear them, checking the garden stakes after an afternoon wind. "Does she know that?" Clara asked. Rowan followed her gaze. "I think she's starting to," he said. It was the shape of things through that spring and into summer, purposeful, accumulating, full of the specific texture of women rebuilding from nothing, which is not a quiet or a gentle process but a loud one, full of opinions and occasional arguments and laughter at unexpected moments and the hard, unglamorous work of people rediscovering their own competence. Margaret taught everything Rowan had taught her, and some things he hadn't. The domestic skills she'd always possessed, yes, but also the rifle, the tracking, the capacity to look at the wilderness without fear. She was a different teacher than Rowan, warmer, more patient with failure, more willing to name what she saw in the women she taught. "You're not clumsy," she told Ruth, who had dropped the rifle 3 times in an afternoon and was visibly furious with herself. "Your hands are adapted for different work. We're just teaching them a new vocabulary. It takes time." "I'm too old to be learning new vocabularies," Ruth said, with the bluntness of a woman who has been disappointed before and would prefer not to build expectations. "You're 58, Margaret said. "I was 56 when I learned. Give it 2 more sessions." Ruth gave it 2 more sessions and hit the mark on the 4th try and said nothing, but stood very still for a moment the way Margaret had stood still that February dawn, and Margaret recognized exactly what was happening and let it happen in peace. It was in the first week of July when Blackthorn Ridge arrived on the mountain. Not all of it. Not the decent people. Not the ones who kept to themselves and wished no one harm. It was specifically and precisely Cliff Dalton who arrived, on a Monday morning when the air was already warm and the garden was at its fullest summer height, and he came with 3 men that Margaret recognized as his ranch hands. Big, certain men who wore their certainty the way other people wear coats, as protection against the cold of doubt. Margaret saw them coming up the trail from the window. She had time. She went to the door of the east sleeping room and said, "Ruth, Clara." Both women appeared immediately, reading her face. She did not explain at length. "Get your rifles and come to the porch." She turned to the other 2 women. "Eliza, take the horses to the back of the barn and stay with them. Nora, there's a pot of beans on the fire. Keep your hand near it and don't go anywhere." She took her own rifle from the wall. She was on the porch when Dalton came into the clearing, and she was not alone. Dalton pulled up his horse 10 yards from the porch steps and looked at the 3 women standing there. Margaret in the center, Ruth and Clara flanking her, all 3 armed, none of them pointing their weapons at anything in particular, all 3 clearly prepared to change that. And something moved across his face that was not quite surprise. He had expected a woman. He had not accounted for what a woman becomes when she has spent 7 months rediscovering her spine. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and his voice had the practiced ease of a man who has never been seriously challenged. "I've had word that Frank's sister is up here running some kind of operation. Thought I'd come see for myself." "You've seen," Margaret said. "It's a homestead. People live here. You can go." Dalton looked at the cabin, at the extended room, at the garden. His eyes moved like an assessor's, cataloging and calculating. "Way I hear it, your arrangement with Creed was temporary. Room for the winter. Well, it's summer now." He spread his hands in a gesture of exaggerated reasonableness. "And that offer I made at the Silver Spur still stands. My laundry house needs workers. Good deal for a woman who's otherwise— Otherwise what? Margaret said. The two words came out level and clear as a rifle shot, and the clearing was very quiet. Dalton blinked. People did not generally interrupt him. Excuse me? Otherwise what? Margaret repeated. She moved down one step, just one, enough to change the geometry. Otherwise too old. Otherwise worthless. Otherwise lucky to take whatever she's given. She stopped on that step and looked at him with the full concentrated attention of a woman who has decided quietly and permanently that she is finished being looked through. Finish the sentence, Mr. Dalton. I'd like to hear you say it plainly. One of his ranch hands shifted in the saddle. Another looked away, and that was interesting. That small sideways look that said the certainty was not quite as uniform as it had appeared. You're being unreasonable, Dalton said, though his voice had lost something, a fraction of its smoothness, the confidence that no one would contradict him. You offered me a laundry house, Margaret said. In October. No wages, no dignity. Just room and board and your goodwill, which is contingent on my usefulness and lasts exactly as long as I remain useful and ask for nothing. She looked at him. I know what that offer is, Mr. Dalton. I've been accepting versions of it my entire life. I am done accepting it. Creed's not here, Dalton said. And that was a threat dressed as an observation, and everyone on that porch understood the dressing and the thing underneath it. No, Margaret agreed. He isn't, and yet here we all stand. She let that settle. You seem to have assumed that Rowan Creed's presence is what makes this situation a poor idea for you. I'd invite you to reconsider that assumption. Clara, to her left, had brought her rifle up to a resting position that wasn't aimed but could become aimed with about half a second's attention. Ruth, to her right, was still, the way a person is still when they have thought through what they will do and made their peace with it. Dalton looked at the three of them. His horse shifted under him, reading the tension the way horses do, pulling at the reins. This isn't over, he said. Most things aren't, Margaret replied. Good day to you, Mr. Dalton. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse, and his men turned their horses, and they rode back down the mountain trail, and the sound of the hoofbeats diminished and then disappeared into the tree line, and the clearing was quiet again except for the wind in the pines and the soft sound of Nora crying inside the cabin. Not from fear, but from the particular overwhelmed emotion of witnessing something you have needed to see for a very long time. Margaret stood on the porch step until they were gone. Then she let out a long breath and turned and found Clara and Ruth both looking at her with expressions she did not immediately know how to respond to. What? She said. Nothing, Clara said. Only, that was something. It was necessary, Margaret said, and walked back inside. She was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her breathing somewhat unsteady. Because bravery is not the absence of fear, but its management, and the fear had simply been waiting for the men to leave before making itself known. When Rowan rode into the clearing at midday, returning from a supply run to the lower trail junction, he came through the door and read the room in approximately 3 seconds. Margaret at the table with her particular stillness, Clara and Ruth with the residual alertness of people recently required to be readier than they'd expected, the general texture of a morning that had contained something significant. He set down the supplies. He pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat down. Tell me, he said. She told him, plainly, without drama, in the same tone she used when reporting the state of the trap lines or the garden's progress. This happened, and then this, and then this. When she was done, Rowan was quiet for a moment. You held the porch, he said. We held the porch. With 3 rifles. With 3 women, she corrected, who happened to have rifles. The distinction matters. He looked at her for a long moment. He'll come back, he said. I know. He won't come back with 3 ranch hands next time. I know that too. She met his eyes. But I needed to do it the first time without you there. Do you understand why? He was quiet. Then, yes, he said. I understand exactly why. And he did. He understood that there are things a person has to do themselves, not because help is unwelcome, but because the doing of it is the point. Because the proof of one's own capacity must be witnessed first by oneself, or it doesn't fully count. Because Margaret Hale had spent 56 years being managed and assisted and directed by other people's judgments of what she could and could not handle, and she needed to stand on a porch with a rifle in her own hands and look at the man who embodied all of that history and say no with her whole body and nobody's help. She needed it to be hers. "I'm proud of you," he said. 3 words, quiet and direct, and she received them the way she received everything he said to her now, with the careful, slightly stunned attention of someone still not entirely accustomed to being seen. "Don't make it into something large," she said, echoing herself from February, from the morning she'd hit the mark on the first try. "I'm not," he said, with the same almost smile he'd had then. "It already is large. I'm just naming it accurately." That evening, the 5 women and Rowan ate together at the extended table he had built in April, and Ruth told a story about her first husband that made everyone laugh with the sharp, cathartic laughter of people releasing accumulated tension, and Nora, the youngest of the women at 53, said quietly that she had not laughed like that in years, and Clara said she hadn't either, and for a moment the table was held together by that shared admission, the recognition that they had all come from places where laughter had become a thing you had to ration because there was not much cause for it. Margaret looked down the table at all of them, at their faces in the lamplight, worn by time and difficulty into their true shapes, stripped of the pretenses that youth requires, and left with something more fundamental. The bone structure of who they actually were, visible now that the softening layers of performance had worn away. She thought about the saloon in October, the chair Frank had stood on, the $50, the floor she had looked at because looking up required a belief that what you saw when you did would be worth the effort. She thought about who she had been then, carrying that canvas bag against her chest with both hands. She looked at Rowan at the other end of the table, and he was listening to Ruth's story with genuine attention, and he glanced up and caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment. And in that moment was everything that had been building since February without either of them finding the adequate words for it. She looked away first, but she was smiling. Outside, the July night was warm and full of sound. Insects, the creek, the horses moving in the barn, the mountain alive and indifferent, and somehow also present in the way that large and old things are present, like a witness that doesn't judge. The cabin light spilled out through the windows and the open door onto the porch where 3 months ago Margaret had stood with a rifle and refused to be made small again. The light from the inside, going out, like a signal, like an answer to something that had been asking for a very long time. Dalton did not come back in August. He did not come back in the first week of September either, and the absence of him was not reassuring. Margaret knew the particular quality of a threat that has gone quiet. She had lived with versions of it for decades. The landlord who stopped sending notices before sending the sheriff. The employer who stopped complaining before simply dismissing without reference. Silence from a man like Cliff Dalton was not peace. It was preparation. Rowan knew it too. She could see it in the way he checked the trail twice a day now instead of once, and in the way he had moved 2 of the rifles from the wall hooks to positions closer to the windows, and in the way he slept lighter. She could tell by the quality of the cabin's silence in the deep hours of the night, the absence of the deep, even breathing she had learned to identify through the wall between their rooms as the sound of genuine rest. They did not discuss it directly. They discussed it in the way people who know each other well discuss difficult things, sideways, through practical action. He taught Ruth and Clara the specific geometry of defending a structure, which entry points mattered and why, which angles of approach from the tree line gave the most warning. Margaret organized the women into a quiet rotation of evening watches without calling it that, framing it as simply keeping an eye on the horses after dark, which was true as far as it went. Life on the mountain did not stop for the threat of Dalton, because life does not stop for threats. It continues alongside them, which is perhaps the most exhausting thing about being in danger. The garden needed harvesting. The preservation stores needed filling. A 6th woman arrived in mid-August, a woman named Helen Marsh, 64 years old, who had traveled 3 days from the far side of the county after receiving a letter from Nora, and who arrived carrying a single carpet bag and a specific kind of composure that comes from having survived the absolute worst your particular life had to offer and discovering you were still standing. Helen had been a school teacher for 30 years. When her husband died and she lost the schoolhouse position to a younger man, she had spent 2 years being moved between the homes of adult children who loved her theoretically and found her practically inconvenient. She arrived on the mountain and looked at the cabin and the garden and the women in the yard and said, with the precision of someone who has spent decades choosing words for young minds, This is a serious place. We try to be, Margaret said. I can teach, Helen said. Reading, writing, arithmetic. If anyone wants learning, I have it. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she said, We'll build you a schoolroom. And Helen's composure flickered for exactly 1 second. A brightness across her face like light through a briefly opened door, before she composed herself again and said, That would be acceptable. Rowan, when told, did not hesitate. Where does she want it? This was the texture of September, full and purposeful and underlaid, always, with the knowledge that Dalton was somewhere in the valley below them, quiet and planning. They built Helen's schoolroom as an extension off the north wall, small but tight and well chinked against the coming cold, with a south-facing window for light and a small stove that Ruth had somehow acquired from the supply rider with a negotiating skill that suggested she had missed her true vocation as a trader. It was the night of September 19th when it happened. Rowan had ridden down to the lower trail junction that afternoon to collect a supply order and meet with a rancher named Aldous, who had been buying surplus venison from the mountain, a transaction that was building toward something more regular and that required the kind of face-to-face conversation that cannot be adequately conducted by written note. He had told Margaret he would be back before dark. He was not back before dark. This happened sometimes. Trail delays, extended conversations, a horse throwing a shoe at an inconvenient moment. Margaret told herself these things as the light faded and the other women came in from their evening tasks and the lamps were lit and supper was put on the table and one chair remained empty. She told herself those things, and she also moved the pistol from its drawer to her apron pocket. These actions were not contradictory. Supper was quiet. Helen read to the younger women from a volume she'd brought in her carpet bag, an adventure story, something with ships and far coasts, and the reading helped, giving the evening somewhere to direct its attention. Margaret sat at the table and appeared to be working on a letter, and was actually watching the window that faced the trail. It was Clara who smelled it first. She came in from checking the horses at 9 o'clock, and she stopped in the doorway with her head up and her nostrils flared and the specific alertness of a woman who grew up in a family of smokers and knows the difference between the smell of a contained fire and the smell of something else. Margaret, she said. One word. Margaret was already standing. She went to the door and opened it and stepped onto the porch, and the night air hit her and she smelled it immediately. Wood smoke, yes, but not from the chimney, not from anything contained. The wrong direction, the wrong quality. Wood smoke has a particular smell when the wood is chosen and seasoned and burning in a properly drafted stove. It has a different smell entirely when it is burning because someone has set it to burn. She looked toward the barn. The barn was not on fire. The cabin was not on fire. The woodpile shelter was. The long, low structure on the west side of the clearing where they stored the winter wood, 3 cords of split pine, dry as paper after a summer of curing, was burning from the far end, and the fire was young enough that it had not yet fully committed, but the wind was coming from the west, and the wood was dry, and the clearing was full of things that would burn. And coming out of the tree line on the west side, 30 yards from the porch, moving fast, was Cliff Dalton. Alone. No ranch hands this time. Just a man with a lantern in one hand and the particular momentum of someone who has been working himself up to something for 2 months and has finally arrived at the doing of it. He had not seen her yet. He was looking at the fire he had set, watching it catch, with the focused satisfaction of a man completing a task. He carried a pistol on his hip, but it was holstered, and his hand was not near it because he had expected to set the fire and be gone before anyone came out, and he had not accounted for Clara smelling the smoke 90 seconds after he'd struck the match. Margaret stepped off the porch. She did not call back into the cabin. She did not take the rifle. She had the pistol in her apron pocket, and she walked toward Cliff Dalton across the clearing with her footsteps quiet on the packed earth. And she was perhaps 15 yards from him when he turned and saw her, and the satisfaction on his face converted in about half a second to something more complicated. "Mrs. Hale," he said. He had the automatic confidence of a man who has always been larger than every room he was in, but there was something working behind his eyes. A rapid recalculation he was trying not to show. "Didn't expect—" "No," she said. "You didn't." She drew the pistol, steady. Both hands, the way Rowan had shown her. Not because she needed both hands for the weight of it, but because 2 hands meant 2 points of contact meant less drift at distance, and she was not going to miss. Dalton went still. Behind her, she heard the cabin door and she heard boots on the porch. And she knew without turning that Ruth and Clara were there, and probably others, and she kept her eyes on Dalton. "That fire needs to come down," she said. "Right now. There's a bucket line from the creek to the west side. My women will handle it. You are going to stay exactly where you are. You won't shoot me," Dalton said. Still confident, still operating from a worldview in which the specific category of person she represented did not shoot people. "I shot a mountain lion at 20 yards in February," Margaret said. "Clean. First try. The mountain lion was faster than you and more dangerous, and I was sorrier to do it." She held his gaze without wavering. "Think carefully about what that tells you." Something shifted in his face. Not fear exactly. A man like Dalton had insulated himself from fear through decades of other people's compliance. More like the sensation of a floorboard giving unexpectedly underfoot, the sudden awareness that the surface he had built his life upon was not as solid as he had believed. Behind her, the bucket line was already forming. She could hear it, the women moving with the organized efficiency of people who had been drilled for emergencies, the splash and slosh of water, Clara calling direction in a steady voice, the hiss of the fire meeting the water. They were handling it. They had always been capable of handling it. That was the whole point. Dalton looked at the women working the bucket line and then back at Margaret and the pistol in her hands and the expression on her face, and she watched him do the arithmetic of a man who has built his empire on other people's helplessness, encountering, for possibly the first time, its absence. "This isn't done," he said, but it came out smaller than he intended. "You keep saying that," Margaret said. "You said it in July. I'll tell you what I told you then. Most things aren't done. But this particular version of things, you coming to this mountain and trying to intimidate women who have done nothing to you except refuse to be used, this version is done tonight." She took one step forward. "When Rowan gets back, he will ride down to Blackthorn Ridge and he will speak to Sheriff Calhoun. You will be here when he arrives, because you will not make it to the bottom of the trail on foot in the dark, and your horse is—" She glanced toward the tree line, calculating, "tied at the eastern bend, which is the long way around. I know this mountain better than you do, Mr. Dalton. I have been living on it for nearly a year." Dalton stared at her, and then, from somewhere behind and above her, from the direction of the barn, where the horses were, where the eastern approach to the clearing came down from the ridge, she heard hoofbeats, fast, one horse, resolute. Rowan came into the clearing at a controlled run, read the scene in a single sweeping glance, the smoke, the bucket line, Margaret standing with a pistol aimed at Cliff Dalton, and pulled his horse up hard and was out of the saddle before the animal fully stopped, and he crossed the clearing toward them with a purpose and a pace that made Dalton take an involuntary step backward. "Don't," Margaret said, without lowering the pistol. To Rowan. He stopped, looked at her. "I have this," she said. His eyes moved from her face to Dalton and back. Something worked in his jaw. Then he stopped where he was, 3 yards to her left, and he crossed his arms, and he waited. She had asked him once if he understood why she'd needed to hold the porch alone in July. He had said yes. She had believed him then. She believed him more now, watching him hold himself back with every instinct pushing him forward, because he understood that the doing of this needed to be hers. The fire was out. She heard the last of the water, heard Clara's voice saying, "That's through, that's done," heard the particular quiet of a fire that has been beaten. "On your knees," Margaret said to Dalton. He looked at her with the last of his contempt, the reflex of a man performing dignity that has already left him. "I am not on your knees," she said again. Same tone. Absolute. "You set fire to my home. You endangered 6 women and everything we have built here. You will wait on your knees in this clearing for the sheriff, and you will do it because the alternative is that I make a different decision with this pistol, and I want to be very clear that I have not yet decided which decision I'm making." She had no intention of shooting him. She knew that. He did not know that, and that distinction was everything. Cliff Dalton went to his knees in the dirt of the clearing. Rowan let out a long breath beside her. She felt rather than heard it. She kept the pistol level until she heard Dalton's breath settle into the rhythm of a man who has accepted his situation, and then she lowered it, though she did not put it away, and she turned and looked at Rowan, who was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something beyond pride, something beyond admiration, something in the territory of awe, which was a thing she had never expected to see directed at herself from anyone. "The fire's out," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, now that the pistol was lowered, were shaking slightly. She would not make a point of that. "I can see that," Rowan said quietly. "The woodpile shelter is damaged but salvageable. The far end will need to be rebuilt." She looked at the structure, already cataloging what remained. "We'll need more split pine before the first snow. Maybe 2 additional cords." "Margaret, the barn is untouched. The cabin is untouched. The garden—" "Margaret." His voice was very quiet, just her name. The way he had said it that first night in the saloon, like it was a complete sentence. She stopped. She looked at him. "You're all right," he said. Not a question, an offering, the space to say it, the permission to confirm it out loud. "I'm all right," she said. And then, because it was true and she was tired of treating true things as secrets, "I was frightened." "I know," he said. "It didn't matter." "No," he said. "It didn't. Because you did it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment in the smoke-cleared dark, the clearing quiet around them. The other women gathered at a respectful distance, Dalton still on his knees in the dirt. "That's what courage is, Margaret. That's the whole of it. Not the absence of fear, just what you do with it." She received that. Let it settle into her the way warmth settles after a long cold. Not dramatically, not all at once, but deep, reaching places that had been cold for a very long time. Sheriff Calhoun arrived before midnight. Rowan had sent Ruth down the mountain on the fastest horse the moment he'd assessed the situation. And the sheriff, a lean, deliberate man who had been in his position long enough to have seen most things and was not easily surprised, came up the trail with 2 deputies and looked at Cliff Dalton kneeling in the dirt with Margaret Hale standing over him with a pistol and said, with notable composure, "Evening, Mrs. Hale." "Sheriff," she said, "thank you for coming." "You want to tell me what happened here?" She told him, clearly, sequentially, in the same tone she used for everything. The July visit, the threats, the fire, Dalton's arrival with the lantern, the bucket line, all of it, with 6 other women standing around her who could corroborate every word. Calhoun listened without interrupting. He was a man who had long understood that which stories got told in Blackthorn Ridge and which did not was largely determined by whose voices were considered worth hearing, and he was looking at 6 women on a mountain at midnight who were very clearly willing to be heard, and he was making adjustments accordingly. "Mr. Dalton," he said, looking at the man still kneeling. "You want to dispute any of that?" Dalton looked up. His face had undergone a significant journey since 9 o'clock. "That woman, she has a name," Calhoun said, "and she has 6 witnesses, and you're currently kneeling in someone else's clearing beside the evidence of a fire you set." He looked at the woodpile shelter, back at Dalton. "So I'll ask again. Dispute any of it?" Dalton said nothing. Calhoun had him on his feet and in restraints in 2 minutes. He paused before walking him to the horses and looked back at Margaret. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "There have been complaints about Dalton's operation for some years. Women who worked his ranch, wages withheld, conditions that weren't right. Nobody ever came forward to stand behind the complaint." "Why not?" Clara asked, from behind Margaret. Calhoun looked at her. "Because they didn't believe anyone would listen," he said, and he said it without defensiveness, with the honesty of a man acknowledging a failure that was partly systemic and partly his own. "If there are women who want to make statements about Dalton, about working conditions, about anything that's been done to them in this territory, I will come back up this mountain, and I will listen, and I will write down every word." He looked at Margaret when he said it. She looked at the women around her, at Ruth, who had walked 30 miles from an unpaid situation, at Clara, who had slept in a wash house, at Helen, who had been moved between households like furniture nobody wanted, but nobody wanted to throw away, at Nora and Eliza, and the newest woman, whose name had not yet been recorded anywhere because no one had thought to ask. "Come back Thursday," Margaret said. "Bring enough paper." Calhoun nodded. He took Dalton down the mountain. The clearing was quiet. Ruth looked at the damaged woodpile shelter. "We'll need to rebuild that end," she said. "In the morning," Margaret said. "It won't take long. The framing's sound." "In the morning, Ruth." A beat. Then Ruth said, "Right," and turned toward the cabin, and the other women followed, and Margaret stood in the cleared night air alone for a moment, feeling the whole long weight of the evening settling through her, and she looked up at the sky, which was enormous and cold, and sequined with stars above the dark mountain ridges. And she thought about the woman in the saloon doorway, looking at the floor. She thought about white knuckles on a canvas bag. She thought about all the years of making herself small enough to fit into the spaces other people decided she was allowed to occupy. She breathed in, breathed out. Rowan came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was, she had come to understand, his particular form of eloquence, the willingness to be present without filling the space with words. After a moment she said, "It's a very large sky." "Always has been," he said. "You just couldn't see it from where you were standing before." She turned and looked at him. This man who had paid $50 for her dignity on an October night and never once asked for anything back. This man who had handed her a rifle and called her capable and meant it. Who had held himself back tonight with everything in him pushing forward because he understood that her victory needed to be her own. "Rowan," she said. I'd like to stay." She said it plainly, the way he had taught her. Facts are facts, no apology necessary. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to be here, because this is where I want to be." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That's the only reason I'd want you to stay." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient, indifferent patterns, and the mountain held them in its dark and massive arms, and inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm through the windows, and low voices moved through the rooms, and the clearing smelled of smoke and pine, and the extinguished fire, and the particular clean smell of a night after crisis, when the danger is gone and what remains is simply life. She put her hand in his, he held it. They stood there for a long time under the enormous sky. Sheriff Calhoun came back on Thursday, as promised. He came alone this time. No deputies, no performance of authority, just a lean man on a gray horse with a saddlebag full of blank paper and a pencil sharpened to serious purpose. Margaret met him at the edge of the clearing and walked him to the cabin. And inside, 6 women were waiting at the table with the particular posture of people who have decided to do something that frightens them and have decided to do it anyway. He sat down. He opened his paper. He said, "Whenever you're ready." And he meant all of them, not just Margaret, and that distinction mattered. She saw it register in the small collective shift of the women's shoulders, the fractional easing that comes when someone treats you as worth listening to for the first time. Ruth Packard spoke first. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not cry. She was not built for public crying, which Calhoun seemed to understand, and he wrote steadily and did not look up except to ask clarifying questions in a tone that contained neither pity nor doubt, only the scrupulous attention of a man assembling an accurate record. Then Clara. Then Nora, then Eliza, who had to stop twice and who came back both times with her jaw set and finished what she had started. Helen Marsh produced a small journal from her carpetbag that turned out to contain 3 years of dated notations, names, incidents, amounts withheld, threats made, recorded with a school teacher's precision for detail, and Calhoun looked at it and said, very quietly, "Ma'am, this is significant." And Helen said, "I know. I've been waiting for someone to agree." Margaret spoke last. She spoke about the saloon, about Frank's offer and Dalton's counteroffer, and the years before both of those things, the position she had been turned away from, the landlords, the slow, systematic erasure of a woman by the consensus of people who had decided her age made her a liability rather than an asset. She spoke plainly and without self-pity because self-pity was not what this was. This was testimony, which is a different thing. Testimony asks to be believed, not consoled, and she was asking to be believed. When she finished, Calhoun sat for a moment with his pencil resting against the paper and looked at the table, and then he looked up. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I've been sheriff of this county for 11 years. In 11 years, I have had conversations with women in situations like yours, and like theirs, in which I was unable to do very much because the law as it existed and as I understood it gave me limited grounds to act." He paused. "What I have in this room today is different. I have a documented arson. I have wage theft. I have documented threats, coercion, and what amounts to forced labor. I have a journal." He looked at Helen. I have enough to put Cliff Dalton in front of a territorial judge and keep him there for a considerable time. He looked around the table. This is going to require some of you to testify in court, in Blackthorn Ridge, publicly, with people in attendance who may not be glad to see it happen. Silence. Then Ruth said, I've done harder things than talk in front of people. And that settled it. Rowan had stayed outside during all of it, working on the woodpile shelter, which he was rebuilding with Ruth's help when she wasn't in the cabin. He had understood without being told that the space inside needed to be entirely the women's, their words, their time, their testimony. And he had occupied himself at a respectful distance with the useful work of repairing what Dalton had damaged, which was perhaps the most accurate possible expression of what he had been doing, in various ways, since October. When Calhoun came out and passed him on his way to his horse, the two men stopped and regarded each other for a moment. That's a remarkable woman you've got up here, Calhoun said. Rowan looked at the cabin. Yes, he said. She is. The others too. Yes. Calhoun nodded slowly, settling into his saddle. I'll send word when the trial date is set. It'll be within the month. I want this done before the weather closes the trail. He looked down at Rowan with the measuring look of a man who respects someone without quite having the full measure of them. You've built something unusual here, Creed. Margaret built it, Rowan said. I provided the materials. Calhoun almost smiled. Then he turned his horse and rode down the mountain, and Rowan went back to the woodpile shelter, and from inside the cabin came the sound of women's voices, the particular sound of people who have said the unsayable and survived the saying, and are now discovering what comes after. The trial of Clifford James Dalton convened in the second week of October in the Blackthorn Ridge Courthouse, which was a solid frame building on the east end of Main Street that smelled of pine resin and old paper and the accumulated weight of the territory's legal history. It was not a large building, but it was full, fuller than anyone in town could remember it being, because the news of what had happened on the mountain had moved through the valley the way news always moves through small places, invisibly and completely, and the people of Blackthorn Ridge had opinions about it that fell, with predictable clarity, along the lines of who they were and what they believed a woman's life was worth. Margaret rode down the mountain on the morning of the first day of testimony with Rowan, beside her and all 6 women behind her, and they rode into town in a line, which was not a planned formation but simply how they had arranged themselves, and it turned out to look, to the people watching from the board sidewalks of Main Street, like something more deliberate than it was. Like a declaration, like an arrival, like the end of a long invisibility. People stared. Margaret looked straight ahead. She had done her looking at the floor. She was finished with it. The courthouse was presided over by a territorial judge named Harlan Foss, who was 67 years old, imported from the Eastern Circuit, and possessed of the particular jurisprudential temperament of a man who has seen enough human misbehavior to have been permanently cured of surprise by it. He ran his courtroom with impersonal precision and allowed no theater that did not serve the record, which suited Margaret fine. She had not come for theater. She had come for the record. Dalton's attorney was a man named Prescott, who was competent and well-dressed and operated on the assumption that the women testifying would be susceptible to the implication that they had misunderstood or misremembered or mischaracterized events, which is a strategy that works reliably against people who are not sure they deserve to be believed. It did not work on Ruth Packard. Mrs. Packard, Prescott said, with the careful patience of a man who has decided to be condescending so gradually that the witness won't notice until it's too late. You claim Mr. Dalton failed to pay you wages, but isn't it true that he provided you with room and board throughout your employment, which constitutes— He provided me with a cot in a building that was also used to store chemicals, Ruth said. The ventilation was inadequate, and I developed a respiratory condition in the second year that I still carry. The food was what was left after the household ate, and I worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 years. She looked at him with the dispassionate accuracy of a woman who has had years to calculate the exact dimensions of what was done to her. If you would like to establish the monetary value of room and board and subtract it from 14 hours times 6 days times 3 years at any wage this court considers fair, I will wait while you do the arithmetic. I believe you will find there is a significant remainder owed to me. Mai unpatshipam. The courtroom made a sound. Judge Foss did not smile, but something moved at the corner of his eyes. Prescott tried a different approach with Clara, with Eliza. with Nora. Each time the approach was a variation on the same theme, that the women had exaggerated or misunderstood or were motivated by some animus toward Dalton that colored their recollection. Each time, the approach failed in a different and specific way because these were women who had spent their lives being told their perceptions were wrong, and they had arrived at this courtroom with the particular steel of people who have decided that this time, this one time, they will not be talked out of what they know to be true. Helen Marsh's journal entered the record as Exhibit 7. Prescott objected. Judge Foss overruled him without apparent deliberation. Margaret testified on the third day. She sat in the witness chair and she looked at the courtroom, at the faces she recognized and the faces she didn't, at Dalton at the defense table who was looking at his hands, at Rowan in the gallery 3 rows back who was watching her with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything, which she had come to understand was his way of saying, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere." And she placed her hands flat on her knees, and she began. She told the truth about all of it, about the saloon and Frank and the $50 and what Dalton had offered and what it had meant, about 7 years of being turned away from positions because of her age, about the specific and grinding arithmetic of poverty experienced by a woman who has no legal recourse and no family willing to help, and a society that has decided her labor has value only when it can be extracted without compensation. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform emotion. She spoke as she had always spoken at her best, plainly and precisely, as someone who respects language enough not to waste it, as someone who has learned that truth has more force when it is delivered without decoration. Prescott's cross-examination of her was the shortest of the week. He asked 4 questions. She answered all 4 with the same direct brevity, and after the 4th answer, he looked at her for a moment and said, "No further questions," with the tone of a man who has decided that continuing is not in his client's interest. After she stepped down and returned to her seat, she felt Rowan's hand briefly on her shoulder. 1 second, 2. The simple weight of a hand that is saying, "I witnessed that," and then it was gone, and the court proceedings continued. Dalton was convicted on 6 counts on the 5th day. Arson. 3 counts of wage theft and labor coercion, with the specificity that Helen's journal made possible. Criminal threatening. And a 6th count that the territorial law had recently added to its books, and that Prescott had clearly not expected to see applied. Unlawful compulsion of labor through coercive living conditions, a count that the judge read aloud in full before delivering the verdict, with an emphasis that suggested he considered it important that the room understand precisely what had been found to have occurred. The sentencing was 5 years hard labor and a financial judgment that amounted to back wages for every woman who had testified, calculated by the court at a fair daily rate for the years of service rendered. The courtroom was very quiet when the gavel came down. Then Ruth Packard, in the 3rd row of the gallery, said in her carrying and entirely unself-conscious voice, "About time." And the courtroom broke the way a held breath breaks, not into chaos, but into the relieved, released sound of people who have been waiting for something that has finally happened. They rode back up the mountain that evening in the golden late October light that comes at the end of days in the high country, when the sun is low enough to turn everything amber and elongated, and the aspens along the upper trail had gone fully gold, and the air smelled of pine and approaching cold, and the particular crispness of a season preparing to change. Nobody talked much on the ride up. They didn't need to. The quiet that settled over the group on the trail was not the uncomfortable silence of people with nothing to say, but the full and spacious silence of people who have said what needed saying, and are now in the aftermath of it, which has its own distinct quality. Not emptiness, but completion, the way a room feels after a long and necessary conversation. The clearing was as they had left it, which was the same as saying it was home. The woodpile shelter was repaired and the new cords of pine were stacked, and the garden had been properly put to bed for winter, and the east sleeping room was finished, and Helen's schoolroom was finished, and smoke was rising from the chimney because Nora, who had stayed behind, had kept the fire going and had supper on. And when they came through the door, the cabin was warm, and the smell of it was the smell of every evening that had accumulated in that space over the past year. Food and wood smoke, and the indefinable specific smell of a place that is lived in by people who care about it. "Well," Helen said, hanging up her coat with the precise motion of a woman who puts things where they belong. "That's done." "That's done," Margaret agreed. It was Ruth who raised the first glass. She had acquired through the supply riders network a bottle of something that might generously be called brandy, and she poured it out into whatever vessels were available, and she held up her cup and looked around at all of them. At this group of women who had arrived on the mountain at various moments of desperation, and who were standing now in a warm cabin at the end of a day that had delivered them something they had stopped believing they were entitled to expect, to being worth listening to, Ruth said. They drank. It was 2 weeks after the trial, on a clear November morning when the first real snow was in the air, but hadn't yet fallen, and the sky had the particular pale brilliance of high altitude in late autumn, that Rowan asked Margaret to marry him. He did not do it with ceremony. He was not a ceremonious man, and she would not have wanted ceremony. She had long since passed the age and the inclination for events designed primarily for other people's witnessing. He did it the way he did everything that mattered, directly, without performance, as a statement of fact offered for consideration. They were in the garden, turning the last of the soil for winter, working side by side with the comfortable physical synchrony of people who have shared the same space through 4 seasons and know each other's rhythms without having to watch for them. He stopped. He looked at her. "I'd like you to be my wife," he said. "Not because either of us needs the legal protection of it, though that isn't nothing, but because I want there to be a word for what you are to me, and that's the best word available." He held her gaze. "You don't have to. I want to be clear about that. Everything continues regardless, but I'd like you to." She was holding a garden fork. She looked at it for a moment, then set it down. "You want there to be a word for it," she said. "I do. You couldn't just say what it is without the word?" "I could," he said, "but the word makes it a matter of public record. And after everything you've done this year, I'd like at least one piece of public record to be in your favor." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had paid $50 for her dignity and called it nothing, who had handed her a rifle and called her capable and meant it, who had stood behind her when she needed him behind her, and beside her when she needed him beside her and in front of her on exactly the one occasion when that had been required and not a single one more, who had taught her to track and to shoot and to read the weather and to trust the evidence of her own competence, who had watched her become, or return to, or perhaps finally arrive at, she was not sure which verb was accurate, the woman she had always contained the potential to be, who had, in short, seen her, not the Margaret that was useful, not the Margaret that was available, not the Margaret of $50 in a saloon, or the Margaret of an old canvas bag held against her chest with white-knuckled hands, but the Margaret who could shoot at 40 yards and negotiate with supply riders, and plan gardens, and hold a porch, and testify in court, and run 4 miles of trapline in the cold, and laugh, genuinely and without reservation, at a campfire in the dark. That Margaret. "All right," she said. "Yes." He exhaled. A short, quiet sound, so small it was almost not there, but she heard it and she understood what it held. Not relief exactly, more like the sound a man makes when something he has been carrying for a long time can finally be set down. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They were married 3 weeks later in the Blackthorn Ridge courthouse, in front of Judge Foss, who had remained on circuit long enough to be available and who performed the brief civil ceremony with the same impersonal precision he brought to all proceedings, though he did pause before signing the record to say, to no one in particular, that in 30 years of jurisprudence he had presided over a number of notable proceedings in this building, and that he would not say which had been most significant, as it was not his habit to editorialize. The women from the mountain were all there, Ruth and Clara and Helen and Nora and Eliza and the newest member of the household, a woman named Ada, who had arrived in late October and who had needed 3 weeks of simply being still before she could begin talking about where she had come from. They filled the first 2 rows of the gallery. They did not cry, because they were not, as a group, women given to public crying, but Clara's chin did a specific thing during the signing of the record that was as close as Clara came to the same impulse. In the back of the gallery, managing to look simultaneously like he had no investment in the proceedings and like a man who would destroy anything that attempted to interfere with them, stood Frank Hale, who had received a note from Margaret informing him of the wedding and who had apparently not been able to construct a reason not to attend. He was sober, which was not his custom. He looked at his sister when she signed the record, and whatever was on his face was complicated enough that he turned away before it resolved into anything legible. Some things do not resolve completely, and Margaret had made her peace with that. Frank was what he was. She loved him in the attenuated way you love someone who has disappointed you so thoroughly and so repeatedly that the love has had to reshape itself around the damage, like a tree grown around an old wound in the wood. She had written him a letter the week after the trial that was not a reconciliation, but was a kind of accounting. Here is what happened. Here is what it cost. Here is where I am now, and you are welcome in my life to the degree that you can be in it without causing harm. He had not responded in writing. His presence in the back of the courtroom was perhaps the response. When they walked out of the courthouse into the November air, the town of Blackthorn Ridge was going about its ordinary business. The boot shop, the mercantile, the Silver Spur already populated at midday with its usual constituency, and several people stopped and looked at the group emerging from the courthouse, at Margaret Hale, who was now Margaret Creed, at the women behind her, at Rowan beside her, and the looks were various. Some were hostile, in the specific way of people who have built an understanding of the world on the assumption that certain people stay in their place and find the evidence that they do not to be personally threatening. Some were curious, in the way of people who have heard a story and are now seeing the people in it and finding them more substantial and more ordinary than the story suggested. And some, not many, but some, were something else. Something that looked, in the cold November light on the main street of Blackthorn Ridge, like the earliest and most tentative form of a reconsideration. Like people seeing something they had not previously seen and filing it away in the part of the mind that stores things that might eventually become the new ordinary. Margaret noticed all of it and said nothing and kept walking. She had done her work in courtrooms and on mountain porches and in the witness chair under Prescott's cross-examination. She was not required to also perform her victory for people who had doubted her right to it. The performance was finished. What remained was simply the living of things. They rode back up the mountain together, all of them, and the snow that had been threatening for weeks finally began to fall as they cleared the lower tree line. Soft, purposeful flakes coming straight down in the windless afternoon, settling on the horses' manes and the women's coats, and the pine boughs along the trail, and on Margaret's hair, which she had left uncovered, because she liked the cold, and because she was, she had decided, allowed to have preferences about things as simple as the feeling of snow in her hair. The clearing appeared through the trees, and the cabin was there, solid and warm and lit. Ada had stayed behind and kept the fire and the lamp, and Margaret pulled up her horse at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a moment. The way she had looked at it on the very first night, from horseback in the dark with her canvas bag and her accumulated damage and her white-knuckled grip on the idea that this too would simply be another hardship to survive. It was not that. It had never been that, or it had been that and had become something else entirely, which is perhaps the more interesting story. Not the one where the place was always safe, but the one where the place became safe because people built it into something worth protecting and then protected it. Rowan stopped beside her. "Still thinking?" he said. "Always," she said. He looked at the cabin too, and the snow falling on the clearing, and the smoke from the chimney going straight up into the gray sky, and 6 women dismounting around them, talking and leading horses toward the barn with the easy collaborative motion of people who have learned each other's rhythms. "Margaret Creed," he said, trying the name. "Rowan Creed," she replied in the same considering tone. "Does it fit?" She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about everything. "It fits better than anything I've worn in a long time," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and briefly, simply, took her hand, held it for a moment, let it go. They rode the rest of the way across the clearing to the barn. In the years that followed, and there were many years, more than either of them had expected, the mountain air being what it was and purpose being the thing that keeps a body honest, the cabin on the mountain above Blackthorn Ridge became what Margaret had written in a letter to Clara in the spring before Clara arrived, what she had seen in the south-facing slope's potential before she had a single additional seed to plant in it, a place where the forgotten found that they had not in fact been forgotten by the only authority that finally mattered, which was themselves. Women came. Some stayed for a season and went back to reconstituted lives in the valley, with skills and steadiness they had not possessed when they arrived. Some stayed longer. A few stayed permanently. Ruth never left, and Helen ran her schoolroom for 11 years and eventually taught the daughters and granddaughters of the original women, because the community that accreted around that mountain cabin over time was not a temporary thing but a persistent one. with children in it and old age, and the full ordinary complexity of lives being actually lived rather than merely survived. Margaret taught everything she knew and then taught what she had learned since learning that. And the thing she was best at teaching, better even than the rifle, better than the garden, better than the trackless winter wilderness, was the thing she had learned most recently and most painfully and most completely. That worth is not assigned by the people who find you inconvenient. It lives in a place those people cannot reach, and it persists through every season of erasure, and it waits, with the patience of something very old and very certain, for the moment when the person who carries it finally agrees to believe in it. She taught that in the way that the most important things are always taught, not through direct instruction, but through example, through the daily accumulating evidence of a life lived without apology, through the specific gravity of a woman who had been told in 100 ways by 100 people that she was nothing, and had decided at 56 years old on a bitter autumn morning in a frontier town to disagree. Rowan grew old on that mountain with the quiet contentment of a man who had found the thing that wars and isolation and 2 decades of deliberate disappearance had convinced him he was not capable of finding. He was not a complicated happiness. He would not have recognized happiness as an end in itself, and Margaret would not have wanted him to be a different man than the one she had learned to love. What he had was more durable than happiness, purpose, and work, and a woman beside him who was his equal in every way that counted, and a community of people whose continued welfare was a project large enough to keep a man out of his own darkness indefinitely. He lived to be 79. In his last winter, when he could no longer manage the ridgelines or the heavy work, he sat by the fire in the rocking chair with the worn wool blanket that had been on its arm since before Margaret arrived, and he watched the cabin he had built with his own hands fill with people and warmth and the specific noise of lives that mattered, and he was not sorry for anything. Margaret sat beside him in the evenings. She held his hand the way she had held it that first time in the clearing in the November snow, the day they rode back from the courthouse together, and the snow came down and she looked at the cabin and felt the full weight of what it had become. She told him once, near the end, when the winter was deep and the fire was low and the cabin was quiet, the others asleep, the mountain holding everything in its ancient, indifferent arms. She told him that she thought about the saloon sometimes, about the floor she had looked at. "I know," he said. His voice was thin, but his eyes were the same, winter gray, watchful, and no longer empty. "I used to be ashamed of it," she said, "looking at the floor." And now, she considered it for a long moment, in the honest way she considered everything. "Now, I think it took more courage than most people will ever know," she said, "to keep standing at all, to walk through that door and get on a horse and go up a mountain in the dark with a stranger and keep going." She paused. "Broken people don't do that. People with nothing left don't do that." She looked at their joined hands. "I had more left than I knew." "Yes," Rowan said, "you did." Outside, the winter moved through the pines the way it always had, enormous and cold and utterly without malice, just the world being the world, indifferent to human suffering and human triumph both, carrying them equally in its great turning. But inside the cabin on the mountain above Blackthorn Ridge, the fire held, and the warmth held, and the hands of 2 people who had arrived at each other from opposite directions of loss held each other in the dark. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The woman nobody wanted had become, in the fullness of time, the woman everyone came to find. And the mountain kept her name long after the last snow fell. The end.